And it's just strange. Annie Guthrie, we don't think is staying there anymore, or her husband. We don't know where they are.
Annie Guthrie and her husband were the last known individuals to see Nancy, her mother, before she disappeared. In the days that followed, investigators returned to Annie's home multiple times. Her vehicle was seized. Evidence was collected with measured restraint. The process unfolded away from public attention, yet its implications were clear. What occurred during those final hours remains largely unspoken. The absence of answers has allowed uncertainty to settle over the timeline, attaching quiet weight to details that once felt ordinary. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, Nancy was at her daughter's home, sharing a meal and moving through familiar family routines. Later, she returned to her own residence. The transition appeared routine. Hours passed. She did not leave again by choice. Within days, law enforcement arrived at Annie's property and began examining the space with deliberate care. The first search took place roughly a week after Nancy's disappearance. Officers focused on a residence located about 4 miles from Nancy's home in the Catalina foothills. Their movements were systematic. Rooms were documented, surfaces were inspected, items were photographed and cataloged before being secured in sealed containers. Gloves separated investigators from the environment they were assessing. Annie's vehicle was impounded as part of the inquiry. Authorities described these actions as procedural, yet the depth and repetition of the searches suggested efforts to reconstruct not only locations, but moments to understand how events unfolded and where gaps remained. The second search occurred on the evening of February 10th and extended late into the night. Investigators moved through the interior with sustained focus, capturing photographs under brief flashes of light that illuminated private spaces now subject to scrutiny. Outside, media presence remained distant as law enforcement continued its work. The operation was carried out with precision, but it also reflected unresolved questions that required closer examination. Each visit to the property, each documented detail, signaled an attempt to ground uncertainty in evidence. Yet, despite the methodical approach, key questions remained unanswered.
Hey guys, alright, so I'm leaving Annie Guthrie's house now. If you look at my previous videos, there were 3 sheriff's deputies there. They showed up.
The deputies arrived, carrying camera equipment and evidence bags, moving through the home with careful restraint. For nearly 3 hours, they traced the contours of each room, their movements quiet, precise, and unhurried. Each gesture carried weight. Each step seemed deliberate, as though the house itself bore witness to what could not be articulated. Shadows stretched across floors and walls, absorbing the meticulous work, the silent scrutiny, leaving behind an atmosphere dense with unanswered questions, lingering in the spaces between them.
They went in with evidence equipment and they were taking photos inside the house, and we know for sure that they were taking photos because we could see flashes through the windows.
The camera flashes moved slowly through the rooms, extending into the garage and shadowed corners, each brief burst of light revealing only fragments of the space. When the deputies eventually stepped outside, one still wore blue gloves. Their expressions offered no clarity. Their statements remained measured and limited to procedure. The home felt emptied, not only of its occupants, but of certainty. Annie Guthrie and her husband were no longer present. Reporter Brian Enton later observed that the second search unfolded in coordination with private security already positioned on the property. Movements appeared organized and controlled, unfolding with a quiet efficiency that suggested preparation. In that careful precision, the house seemed suspended in silence. Details were documented, areas were examined. Yet despite the thoroughness of the process, the space retained an unresolved weight, as if the structure itself held questions that had not yet found answers.
And when I got here, there were 3 deputies that had just arrived. They have private security here. NBC hired private security, I'm told.
The security guards stepped aside as deputies moved through the property without interruption. They carried camera equipment and evidence materials in secured cases, their hands gloved as they proceeded with clear procedural focus. Every movement appeared deliberate and controlled. The rooms remained still around them. Silence filled the space, heavy and unbroken, as investigators documented and examined the environment. The process unfolded without urgency, reflecting the structured approach of an inquiry that was still seeking clarity within an uncertain moment. It appeared that the operation had been coordinated ahead of time. The presence of security suggested awareness of the scheduled entry, and deputies moved through the property with procedural familiarity and quiet purpose. The house stood empty, still, and silent as they worked. Each action was carried out with measured precision, reflecting preparation and the seriousness of what investigators were attempting to determine within its walls. The family reportedly consented to the search, yet a quiet question remained. Why, 7 days after Nancy's disappearance, were investigators photographing multiple rooms inside Annie's home? At the same time, FBI agents examined the low-lying brush surrounding the property, carefully scanning the terrain for anything that might contribute to the timeline. On February 10th and 11th, deputies moved through the neighboring area, going door to door, distributing flyers, and asking residents about unusual activity during the hours before Nancy vanished. The outreach reflected an effort to gather fragments of observation from a wider community, extending the scope of inquiry beyond a single residence. The second search coincided with the release of surveillance images showing a masked individual interfering with Nancy's front door camera. Investigators appeared to compare those images with details from inside Annie's home, attempting to reconstruct events through overlapping digital and physical traces. Former FBI officials have noted that repeated searches of connected properties are not uncommon when investigators are examining possibilities involving targeted intrusion or ransom-related motives. Such reviews often involve financial records, personal communications, and digital data alongside physical inspection. Even so, public speculation intensified, shaped by the family's visibility, the background of Tommaso Cayan, and the seizure of the vehicle. The family publicly maintained unity, issuing statements and considering legal action against outlets circulating unverified assertions. Sheriff Chris Nanos emphasized that no formal suspects had been named and that the searches were conducted to cover all bases and eliminate potential leads. At the center of the investigation remained a single, defining fact: Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Cayan were the last known individuals to see Nancy alive. The hours between that final interaction and her disappearance became the core of scrutiny. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, Nancy left her home in the Catalina foothills and traveled by Uber to her daughter's residence, arriving at approximately 5:32 p.m. Footage from the ride showed her appearing calm, showing no visible distress. The driver cooperated with investigators and was not regarded as a suspect. Nancy spent around 4 hours at Annie's home. Dinner was shared. Time passed in ordinary conversation and routine activities. Around 9:48 p.m., Tommaso drove her back to her residence, a distance of roughly 4 miles. Digital records indicate the garage door opened at 9:48 p.m. and closed 2 minutes later at 9:50 p.m., with Tommaso reportedly remaining until he observed that she had safely entered before leaving. As investigators reviewed the timeline, subtle adjustments in official statements drew attention. The drop-off was initially attributed specifically to Tommaso before being broadened in language to reference family, a change observers noted carefully. After the garage door closed, the night appeared to return to normal. Nancy was presumed to be inside, preparing for rest. Yet in the early hours of February 1st, irregularities surfaced. At 1:47 a.m., the doorbell cameras went offline. At 2:12 a.m., motion sensors detected activity near the front entrance. At 2:28 a.m., data from the pacemaker monitoring system recorded movement, indicating that Nancy had traveled at least 30 feet from the location of her phone. Within these minutes, the stability of the evening gave way to a narrow window that would come to define the investigation. The garage door had opened and closed. Nancy appeared to have entered her home. Yet what unfolded afterward became the most closely examined segment of the timeline. Between 1:47 a.m., when the doorbell cameras went offline, and 2:28 a.m., when the pacemaker system recorded movement, 41 minutes passed largely without direct visibility inside the house. For an elderly woman alone in her residence, that interval became a focal point of inquiry. Former investigators have suggested that such a duration could signal more than a brief intrusion. It raises questions about intention, familiarity with the space, or an event that required time rather than speed. In most abduction cases, movement is swift and confined to minutes. The length of this window introduced uncertainty. It suggested possibilities that ranged from disruption to miscalculation to someone operating with prior knowledge of the property. Investigators conducted repeated interviews with Annie and Tommaso, revisiting the home, inspecting the garage, and examining the vehicle that had been impounded. Each review reflected an effort to reconcile digital data with physical space and witness accounts. By February 11th, no formal suspects had been identified, and the timeline remained under examination. The investigation later extended south to Rio Rico, Arizona, near the Mexican border. Surveillance images extracted from Nancy's tampered Google Nest doorbell revealed a masked individual dressed entirely in dark clothing. Gloves covered the hands. A backpack appeared fully packed. A flashlight was held near the mouth. A pistol was visible at the waist. The imagery conveyed preparation and deliberate action. Analysts observed the backpack first, noting that its presence implied forethought, potentially containing tools or restraints. The individual approached the front door, made contact with the camera, then crouched to obscure the lens with surrounding foliage. Movements appeared controlled and purposeful. The figure was described as right-handed, of medium build and average height, and was seen carrying a weapon. On the same day, a man was briefly detained during a traffic stop in Rio Rico, questioned, and later released without charges. Family representatives stated he did not resemble the person captured in the footage. Beyond that detention, authorities released limited information, emphasizing that no suspect had been officially confirmed. The scale of the response, roadblocks, federal agents, and extensive property searches underscored the seriousness with which the case was being treated. While proximity to the border fueled speculation, officials described the investigation as focused on determining intent and tracing movement through evidence and digital records. As attention widened beyond Tucson, another development emerged: anonymous communications sent to media outlets. Days after Nancy disappeared, multiple emails containing ransom demands were received. The first significant message, dated February 3rd, requested payment in Bitcoin and referenced details that had not been publicly disclosed, including Nancy's Apple Watch, which she was not wearing, and a damaged floodlight at her residence. Analysts described the correspondence as structured and calculated, crafted to establish credibility. The message did not open a channel for negotiation. It presented a demand and left the family confronting a single unresolved question: whether she was alive. Similar communications reached other media outlets, some carrying threats that referenced harm to Nancy if demands were not met. Later, a man in California was arrested for sending fabricated ransom emails that imitated the structure of the legitimate messages, but lacked the specific details contained in the original correspondence. He was charged, and the case highlighted how false claims and deliberate imitation could complicate an already fragile investigation. Through it all, one fact remained unchanged: there was no confirmed proof of life. No verified photographs, video recordings, or audio evidence established her condition. Public appeals reflected that absence. Savannah Guthrie spoke on behalf of the family, acknowledging the reality that even visual material can be manipulated in an era where digital fabrication has become increasingly sophisticated. As days passed, uncertainty deepened. Each unverified message extended the timeline without providing clarity. The communications combined traditional ransom language with encrypted digital demands, underscoring the challenge investigators faced in confirming authenticity. On February 4th, Savannah released the first public video from the family. Tears were visible, yet her voice remained controlled and deliberate. She spoke of Nancy's age, her fragile health, and the medications that were no longer being administered. In the following days, Cameron Guthrie issued direct appeals, seeking any evidence that would confirm whether Nancy was alive. By February 7th, the tone shifted. "We received your message," Savannah stated. "We are willing to pay. We beg you to return our mother so we can celebrate with her. This is the only way we will have peace." The statement carried emotional weight, not through dramatics, but through restraint. It reflected a family suspended between hope and the possibility of irreversible loss. By February 11th, Savannah addressed the public again, thanking supporters and urging anyone with information to come forward while recognizing the ongoing efforts of law enforcement. The investigation had drawn attention at the highest levels, with officials noting that senior leadership had reviewed available surveillance footage and encouraged public cooperation with the FBI. Despite that visibility, practical obstacles remained. Nancy's home security system had lapsed weeks before her disappearance. Cameras had been removed or misaligned. Tire impressions in the driveway had been partially altered by rain. Her medical condition added urgency. She had a pacemaker implanted in 2023 and required daily medications for blood pressure, chronic pain, and blood thinning, none of which were being administered. Medical experts warned that prolonged interruption of care could carry serious consequences. As of that period, the FBI operated a 24-hour command post. More than 500 tips had been recorded. Billboards circulated across multiple states. Over $150,000 had been raised to support search efforts. Community vigils and volunteer searches continued across Tucson. Yet no suspect had been formally identified, and no charges had been filed. Amid these developments, the 41 minutes, the window inside her home that remained without full visibility, persisted as the central uncertainty. It represented a gap in time that had not been fully explained. In that silence, the absence itself became the defining element of the case, a moment suspended between evidence and unanswered questions, between investigation and truth still waiting to emerge.